April 12, 1945. Harry Truman was enjoying a bourbon with House Speaker Sam Rayburn in the Capitol building, laughing, relaxed. The weight of war felt a little lighter that afternoon. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was urgent. "Come to the White House immediately. Use the side entrance." Truman thought maybe Roosevelt wanted to discuss legislation, maybe budget items. Nothing urgent. He was wrong. He arrived at 5:25 p.m., shirt soaked with sweat from half running through the streets of Washington. Eleanor Roosevelt stood in the doorway. Her face told him everything before she spoke a word. She stepped forward, placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Harry, the president is dead." The room tilted. Truman's mouth went dry. He finally stammered, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor's response was immediate, devastating. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." But that famous exchange, the one history remembers, was just the beginning of the story. 3 days later, Eleanor Roosevelt would tell Truman a truth so brutal, so honest, that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Welcome to History of World War II. I'm so glad you're here. If you're new to this channel, let me tell you what we do. We don't just recite dates and battles. We dig into the human stories, the moments of courage, betrayal, and truth that shaped our world, but never made it into your textbook. The kind of history that makes you see the present differently. If this is your first video with us, hit that subscribe button right now. We release deep dives like this every week, and I promise you'll never see history the same way again. And to everyone who's already part of this community, to those of you who comment, share, and come back week after week, thank you. Seriously. You're the reason this channel exists. You're the reason we can keep telling these stories. Now let's talk about the most brutal truth any First Lady ever told a president, and what it teaches us about leadership, honesty, and the courage to tell uncomfortable truths. Within 72 hours of taking office, Harry Truman discovered something that made his blood run cold. He had met with President Roosevelt exactly twice since becoming vice president. Twice, in 82 days. Think about that. The President of the United States, in the middle of the largest war in human history, had basically ghosted his own vice president. Truman was drowning in information, Manhattan Project, atomic bomb. Never heard of it until after Roosevelt died. Agreements made at Yalta with Stalin and Churchill. Never consulted. Secret communications about post-war Europe. Never briefed. Everything he should have known for months was hitting him all at once like a tidal wave, and he had to make decisions. Immediately. About the atomic bomb. About Soviet expansion. About ending the war. Here's what this teaches us. No matter how indispensable you think you are, you have a duty to prepare others. Because one day, you won't be there. Roosevelt forgot that lesson, and it nearly broke his successor. April 15th, 3 days after FDR's death. Eleanor Roosevelt asked to see Truman privately. She came to the White House ostensibly to collect personal items. Photographs, letters, mementos of 12 years in that building. But that wasn't why she was really there. What she told Truman in that meeting was never officially recorded, but multiple historians have pieced it together from Truman's diaries, Eleanor's private letters, and interviews conducted years later. What she revealed would shatter every myth about Franklin Roosevelt and give Truman something he desperately needed: the truth. Eleanor sat across from Truman in the Oval Office. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Franklin was dying, Harry. He'd been dying for at least a year, and I let him hide it from you." Truman went still. She continued, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of guilt. His blood pressure had been dangerously high since 1943. He suffered what were almost certainly small strokes. His hands shook so badly in private that he could barely sign his name. During meetings, he would zone out. His mind just gone, floating somewhere else. She paused, looked Truman directly in the eye. At Yalta, he was so weak that Stalin and Churchill noticed. They privately told their advisors they were concerned about his health. But Franklin kept going, kept pretending everything was fine. Truman felt anger rising in his chest, not at Eleanor, at Roosevelt, at the situation. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "I should have told you, Harry. God knows I thought about it many times. But Franklin didn't want you to know. He didn't want anyone to know. And I convinced myself that respecting his wishes was more important than preparing you for what was coming." Her voice cracked slightly. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Here's the lesson for all of us. Sometimes loyalty means telling hard truths, even when it's uncomfortable. Eleanor learned this too late, but she's teaching it to us now." Truman asked the question burning in his mind. Why didn't he prepare me? Why keep me at such a distance? Eleanor's answer was brutally honest. "Franklin never wanted you as vice president, Harry." The words hung in the air like smoke. "The party bosses forced you on him at the 1944 convention because Henry Wallace was too radical. Franklin resented it. He wanted to choose his own successor, and you weren't it." Truman had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed still stung. Eleanor leaned forward, but there was something even darker underneath. Franklin was in denial about his own mortality. He'd convinced himself he would survive the war, serve out his term, maybe even run again in 1948 if he felt better. She shook her head. It wasn't rational, but dying men rarely are. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who reshaped American government, who led us through depression and war, could not accept that his body was betraying him, so he simply pretended it wasn't happening. "And all of us," Eleanor said quietly, "all of us around him enabled that delusion, because it was easier than confronting the truth." This is where the story becomes universal. How many of us avoid preparing for transitions because we can't accept change? How many leaders refuse to mentor successors because they can't imagine themselves being replaced? Roosevelt was a great man, but he was still human, and his human weakness nearly crippled American leadership at the most critical moment in history. Truman sat back in his chair, processing. His entire understanding of Roosevelt was crumbling. "There's more you need to know," Eleanor said, "about his final days." Truman asked about Warm Springs, about how Roosevelt had died. What Eleanor told him next was a secret the American public wouldn't learn for decades. "Franklin went to Warm Springs in late March," Eleanor began. "He was exhausted, gray, complaining of terrible headaches and neck pain that wouldn't stop." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But he didn't go alone, Harry. He went with Lucy Mercer Rutherford." Truman's eyebrows shot up. He knew vaguely about the scandal from decades ago, but he thought that was ancient history. "The woman he was in love with in 1918, Eleanor continued, her voice steady but cold. "The woman whose affair with Franklin nearly destroyed our marriage. He'd been seeing her again. During the war, she visited the White House. He arranged for her to attend his 4th inauguration without telling me." Eleanor's composure was remarkable. Truman could see the pain underneath, but she wasn't drowning in it. She was stating facts. "When I arrived at Warm Springs after he died, Lucy had already been spirited away. But I knew she'd been there. I knew the portrait being painted of Franklin in his final hours was being done by Lucy's friend. I knew the love of his life had been by his side when he died." She looked at Truman, "While I was in Washington." "Why are you telling me this?" Truman asked softly. Eleanor's answer was immediate. "Because you need to know that great men are still just men. Franklin made terrible decisions in his final months. He wasn't thinking clearly. He left you in an impossible situation, and I am partially responsible for allowing it to happen." She leaned forward. "You have every right to be angry with me, with him, with all of us who stood by and let this happen. The value here is profound. Even the people we put on pedestals are deeply flawed, and sometimes the greatest act of love is being honest about those flaws so others can learn from them." Eleanor wasn't destroying her husband's legacy. She was humanizing it, and in doing so, she was freeing Truman to be his own kind of leader. The medical details Eleanor shared were staggering. In March of 1944, Eleanor said, Franklin's blood pressure was measured at 260/150. Truman, who knew little about medicine, looked confused. Eleanor explained. Normal blood pressure is 120/80, Harry. Franklin's was more than twice that. It's called hypertensive crisis, an immediate medical emergency. And he was still running for a fourth term, still making decisions about millions of lives. She continued. He lost 25 pounds in the months before his death. His suits hung off him. He couldn't concentrate for more than 15 or 20 minutes at a time. At Yalta in February, just 2 months before he died, he was so exhausted that he agreed to things he normally never would have. Like what? Truman asked. Like giving Stalin massive concessions in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Franklin was too tired to fight, too sick to see clearly. And now you're stuck with agreements that will haunt us for decades. Truman felt the weight pressing down on him even more. He asked the question that had been building. Did he know he was dying? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. I think somewhere deep down he knew, but he refused to acknowledge it. He never put his affairs in order. He never sat down with you to brief you properly. He never prepared the nation for a transition. She looked out the window. It was perhaps his greatest failure as president, not his economic policies, not the court-packing plan, not even the internment of Japanese Americans, which I fought against. She turned back to Truman. His greatest failure was leaving this nation rudderless at the most critical moment imaginable. Here's what we can learn. Denial doesn't make reality go away. It just makes the consequences worse for everyone who depends on you. Eleanor then said something that would define Truman's presidency. Franklin thought he was indispensable, Harry. He thought no one else could finish what he started. He thought the nation needed him, not the office, not the democratic process. Him. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. But you're going to have to prove him wrong. You're going to have to show that our democracy is bigger than any one man, even a great man. You're going to have to do it while everyone compares you unfavorably to him. While newspapers say you're not smart enough, not experienced enough, not Roosevelt enough. Her voice softened. It's not fair, but that's the situation we've left you in. Truman appreciated her honesty, but it was terrifying. He was inheriting a war still raging in the Pacific, a secret nuclear weapons program, complex diplomatic entanglements with Stalin, an expectation that he would fill the shoes of the most consequential president since Lincoln, and he had essentially zero preparation. The conversation turned to practical matters. Franklin's papers are a disaster, Eleanor told him. He kept no systematic records of his conversations with Churchill and Stalin. Much of what was discussed at Tehran and Yalta exists only in scattered notes and in Franklin's fading memory. She shook her head. Key decisions about Poland, Germany, the United Nations, they were made on verbal agreements and handshakes. There's no paper trail, Harry. Just you trying to piece together what America actually promised. This is a leadership lesson we ignore at our peril. Document your decisions. Create systems. Build institutional memory. Because when you're gone, someone else has to pick up the pieces. Roosevelt failed at this, and it nearly broke American foreign policy. Eleanor also warned Truman about Roosevelt's inner circle. Some of them have been taking advantage of Franklin's condition, she said bluntly. Admiral Leahy has probably been making decisions in Franklin's name. The military has been running the war with almost no civilian oversight because Franklin simply couldn't focus anymore. She paused. Some cabinet members hadn't seen the president in weeks before he died. He was too exhausted or confused to meet with them. Eleanor looked directly at Truman. The image of Franklin as this masterful, in-control war leader, it's been a carefully maintained fiction for the last 6 months. Truman felt betrayed, not just by Roosevelt, but by the entire system that had propped up this illusion. He asked Eleanor directly, "Why are you telling me all this? Why destroy my faith in him?" Her response was immediate and fierce. "Because faith won't help you lead, Harry. The truth will. You're not stepping into Roosevelt's shoes. You're cleaning up the mess he left behind. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can actually do the job." It was perhaps the most honest assessment any First Lady had ever given about her husband's failures. But Eleanor Roosevelt had never been conventional. What this teaches us, sometimes the greatest gift you can give a leader is not encouragement, but clarity. Not praise, but truth. Truman asked one more question, the one that mattered most. Did you try to get him to prepare me? Eleanor's face tightened. For the first time in the conversation, she looked genuinely pained. Yes, multiple times. I told Franklin he needed to bring you into the inner circle, to brief you on major decisions, to treat you as a real partner, not just a placeholder. She looked down at her hands. But Franklin waved me off every time. He said you were just a hack from the Pendergast machine in Missouri, that you lacked vision, that you'd be fine because the cabinet would handle things. Eleanor's voice grew quieter. I pushed, but not hard enough. And now I'm living with the guilt of knowing I could have done more, should have done more. This moment is crucial for us to understand. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the strongest, most independent women in American history, struggled to stand up to her husband when it mattered most. It reminds us that speaking truth to power is hard, even for the powerful. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor continued helping Truman. She told him which advisors to trust and which were protecting their own interests. She gave him insights into Churchill's personality, how to handle the British Prime Minister's theatrical nature. She warned him that Stalin was far more cunning than Franklin had wanted to believe, that Roosevelt's hope for post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union was probably naive. She gave Truman a crash course in realities that Roosevelt's optimism and declining health had obscured. The historical record shows that Truman both appreciated and resented Eleanor's honesty. He appreciated having someone willing to tell him the truth without sugarcoating it. He resented the implication that he was unprepared, even though it was absolutely true. But most of all, he resented Franklin Roosevelt for putting him in this impossible position. Truman would later write in his diary that Roosevelt had been criminally irresponsible in his final year, that a man who knew he was dying had no business running for a fourth term, that the whole situation was a damn mess that could have been avoided. But Eleanor's brutal honesty also created a bond between them. Truman knew she could have protected Franklin's legacy by staying silent. She could have let Truman flounder, let history blame him for struggling. Instead, she chose to help him succeed, even if it meant tarnishing her husband's image. That took extraordinary courage. It took integrity. And it gave Truman something invaluable in a city built on lies: the truth. Years passed. Truman made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He confronted Stalin at Potsdam, taking a harder line than Roosevelt ever had. He navigated the post-war world that Roosevelt had left in chaos, creating the Marshall Plan, establishing NATO, recognizing Israel. He proved that American democracy was bigger than any one man, that the office mattered more than the person in it. And then, years after leaving office, Truman wrote Eleanor a private letter. In it, he thanked her for her honesty in those early days. He told her that her willingness to tell him uncomfortable truths had helped him understand something crucial. He couldn't try to be Roosevelt. He had to be Truman. That realization, born from Eleanor's brutal honesty about her husband's failures, had freed him to lead in his own way, to make his own decisions, to leave his own legacy. Eleanor kept that letter until her death. It was found among her personal papers, worn from being read many times, creased from being folded and unfolded. A reminder of a moment when honesty mattered more than legacy. This is the heart of the story. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty isn't protecting someone's image. It's telling the truth they were too afraid to tell themselves. So here's the question for all of us. Was Eleanor Roosevelt right to tell Truman the truth? Or should she have protected Franklin's legacy and let Truman figure it out on his own? On one hand, she violated her husband's trust, exposed his weaknesses, revealed intimate details about his declining health and his affair with Lucy Mercer. On the other hand, she gave Truman the tools he needed to succeed. She chose the nation's future over her husband's reputation. She chose honesty over comfortable lies, and in doing so, she helped Truman become one of the most consequential presidents in American history, not by being Roosevelt, but by being himself. Here's what this story teaches us today. First, no one is indispensable. Prepare others, build systems, document your knowledge, because one day someone else will have to do your job. Second, honesty is sometimes the greatest gift. Not flattery, not comfortable lies. Truth, even when it hurts. Third, great leaders aren't perfect. They're human, and acknowledging their humanity doesn't diminish their greatness. It makes it more remarkable. Eleanor Roosevelt understood all of this, and Harry Truman never forgot it. If this story made you think differently about leadership, honesty, and the courage it takes to tell uncomfortable truths, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these stories. And if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We release deep dives like this every single week. Stories that make you see history and yourself differently. Hit that subscribe button. Join this community. To everyone who made it all the way to the end, to those of you who've been with us for months or even years, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, you make this channel possible. You make these stories matter. Your comments, your insights, your passion for history. It's what keeps me researching, writing, and creating these videos week after week. Here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know. Would you have told Truman the truth like Eleanor did? Or would you have protected FDR's legacy? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and some of you have insights that are honestly better than anything I could write. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone struggling with whether to tell a hard truth. Someone dealing with a difficult transition. Someone who needs to know that honesty, even painful honesty, can be an act of love. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these stories. I'll see you in the next one.